MEPs will debate tomorrow how the EU should respond to the case of Jamal Khashoggi, the Washington Post journalist who walked into a Saudi Arabian consulate never to be seen again. But Angela Merkel isn't waiting for a debate or a vote. The German Chancellor is speaking up. She's calling for a freeze on German arms sales to Saudi Arabia, and she's encouraging other European leaders to follow. Her comments come as new CCTV footage shows Khashoggi alive just hours before he went missing. That's after an explosive admission from Saudi Arabia after initially saying Khashoggi left the consulate alive. The Saudi foreign minister told Fox News that he was killed during a botched interrogation and that it was, quote, a rogue operation, and that the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman had no knowledge of the plan. All right, let's hear what the German Chancellor had to say about the case this weekend.
Also erst einmal verurteilen wir diese Tat in aller Schärfe, das haben wir gestern auch deutlich gemacht. Zweitens gibt es dringenden weiteren Klärungsbedarf, also es ist längst nicht das auf dem Tisch und sind längst auch nicht die Verantwortlichen zur Rechenschaft gezogen worden. Drittens stimme ich all denen zu, die sagen, gerade was auch die sowieso schon limitierten, aber was Rüstungsexporte anbelangt, kann das nicht stattfinden in dem Zustand, in dem wir im Augenblick sind. Und viertens werden wir auch international weiter über Reaktionen sprechen.
So we've had a lot of reaction, condemnation, shock, some people saying let's wait for the investigation. But here's Angela Merkel calling for an end to arms sales, well, to halt the arms sales. Do you think this is in fact going to punish or hurt Saudi Arabia at all? I'll put that to you, Hans.
No, I think it's the right reaction in this particular case. I myself have met, for instance, Fidel Castro 4 times. And of course, he is also guilty of many killings in his own country. But in this particular case, I think it is very obvious that we have here a head of state, or a head of government, I should say, acting, being in charge of this killing. Everything points towards it. So you can't really arm this fellow as long as he is in power. So I would suggest that other European governments follow, number one. Number two, they should make it clear that it depends on whether Mr. Salman is really guilty, and if he is, then they will not resume arms delivery until he is gone.
I mean, it's easy to say that, but is it even possible to know that?
Well, if they can't prove it, then they should not send the arms. Very simple.
All right, so do you think this is the right way to go? Would it really hurt? I mean,
I actually think it is long overdue. We have voted for an arms embargo on Saudi Arabia in this House 4 times because of the war in Yemen, which should have been reason enough.
But they could just go get it somewhere else, right?
Yes, they could, but at least we would have the moral high ground, and I think that's very important. And we now see that this regime is lying, and it's unreliable, and those who thought that in Mohammed bin Salman and his government they would have a reliable partner can no longer really keep that up. So I think the lies have now become so serious that the credibility is entirely gone for those who still had it.
Because you're talking about a moral high ground, but let's look at what this actually means for them, you know, in terms of numbers. Because how much does the EU stand to lose if it follows Germany's example, for example? Saudi Arabia is Europe's biggest customer when it comes to weapons sales. Let's take a look. The EU exports about 196 billion euros worth of arms worldwide, including missiles, aircraft, ships and tanks. Saudi Arabia buys 11.4% of them, followed by Egypt at 9.9% and Qatar at 8.5%. I mean, you know, as I was saying earlier, they could probably get arms elsewhere. What impact would this have on Europe? Would other nations follow on the basis of, would this hurt them?
Well, there's one way around it. That is for Saudi Arabia to react, to replace this crown prince or establish beyond doubt that he is not guilty.
Right, it's easy to take a moral high ground, but what about the people who are working in these industries? You know, they would argue, what about my job? Do I care?
Well, I think jobs are really not the main point here. The point is the already very unstable and explosive situation in the Middle East. And if you look at the complete lack of strategic insights that this Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has displayed in the murder of this journalist, Mr. Khashoggi, alone, and then look at the war in Yemen, which is also completely irresponsible. 8 million people on the brink of starvation. That is reason enough for an EU-wide weapons embargo. We've called for it in this House, so I think what the Chancellor is doing is good. It's better now than never.
So you're raising it, the point. There have been a lot of people displaced, killed in the war in Yemen, backed by Saudi Arabia, yet why now? Why just now?
Because I think the credibility or the hope that people had in Mohammed bin Salman as a reformer has completely burst. This whole bubble of promise and narrative of reform can no longer hold. I mean, the lies that we've heard over the past week since the disappearance of Mr. Khashoggi are so astounding that you really have to ask yourself whether this is a responsible government. And I think the only answer is no. And if you look at the human cost in Yemen and elsewhere, the repression of women's rights activists, homosexuals, journalists like Raif Badawi, who was flogged with lashes that almost killed him, I believe there's a series of reasons why we should not sell arms to Saudi Arabia, and the other countries on the list, UAE and Egypt, are eligible for embargoes as well.
Of course, there are other countries and other leaders. Take Putin, for example. We just had a vote here in this European Parliament to put Saudi Arabia on the agenda for the next couple of days. And even the leftist people supported it. Now, Putin had obviously ordered somebody to be killed in England. And a British national was killed. The left would never vote for the same thing.
And all these governments,
when it gets to Putin.
These governments obviously will deny this.
Take nobody mentioned this afternoon Iran, which is one of the worst governments in the world.
We're not selling arms to them for good reasons as well. But I hope the Conservatives will join.
I did say that we shouldn't sell arms to.
So do sanctions ever work, though? You're talking about things that have happened. Do they ever work? I mean, it's a symbol of your moral high ground, as you say, but does it work?
Well, there's also human rights sanctions, and I think that those are also very appropriate here to target the individuals that are responsible for this brutal murder by visa restrictions, asset freezes, making it harder to go shopping in Paris, send children to good universities in Europe.
Or visit the yachts which they have parked in Nice. I think this is the right reaction. We should really punish the people in the leadership, like, for instance, the Americans punish those in Russia and put some sanctions on them, which hurts them more than anything else.
When Turkey comes out with their investigation tomorrow, will you trust what they say? Would you believe it?
It's difficult to say. It depends on what they come out with. I don't trust Erdogan in this particular case. However, I think he has some motivations to come up with the truth. And I should say, thanks God, he has obviously more facts and perhaps can pull the rug out under the Saudi government lies.
And what about Parliament tomorrow? What kind of consensus? Do you think there will be a consensus tomorrow?
Well, we've called for an independent investigation precisely to be absolutely sure and not to get stuck in the blame game between two countries. So I think an independent investigation, as the UN called for, is very important. And this Parliament, well, I hope that despite previous examples where the EPP and the ECR were reluctant to condemn human rights violations in Saudi Arabia, tomorrow in the debate and Thursday in the vote, we will see a unanimous condemnation of the brutal, gruesome, unacceptable murder of Jamal Khashoggi.
And just very briefly, if you're alienating Saudi Arabia like this, is it putting a strategic partnership in danger where you keep the peace, sort of? You just keep you don't trust Saudi Arabia, but you just keep them there?
Well, that's a very, very complex question. You're right. I mean, very often the politicians are sort of in between. Should they be aggressive against such a government, opening brackets, regime change, closing brackets, and risk wars with a lot of losses to civilians? Or should they hold up their human rights records? The Americans have very often in the past tried to do that and created other side effects like wars, which were even worse. So it's not as simple as it seems to be.
Well, what is crystal clear is that Mohammed bin Salman has alienated Saudi Arabia from the international community and not the other way around.
Right.